An example of the type of terror endured by religious Jews and their courage is seen in the following account. Red Army soldiers burst into the Novardok yeshiva. The commanding officer drew his gun and demanded that the yeshiva chief rabbi immediately close the yeshiva or be shot. Just before this incident, a telegram from a great Torah scholar, which read simply, "Our merciful Father," had been smuggled past the Red Army lines by other Novardok disciples and brought to this yeshiva. The words were the very same as the first two words of the prayer for the souls of Jews who came to lay down their lives rather than convert to a different religion. To the students, the message was clear. The chief rabbi calmly rose from his chair and unbuttoned his shirt. Without a touch of emotion, he walked over to the officer, held up his shirt, and said, "Shoot." No sooner had he done this than the students of the yeshiva followed his lead. One by one, they all rose from their seats, unbuttoned their shirts, lined up behind the chief rabbi, and repeated his one word, "Shoot." The soldiers were completely taken aback. Never had they encountered such a reaction. They were accustomed to eyes struck with fear, anguished cries, pleading and begging on knees, and faces pinched in silent pleas for mercy, all of which was generally followed by the beastly kicks and deadly gunfire. Either out of total confusion or out of respect and admiration for an act of such raw courage, the soldiers withdrew without firing a shot, and the Novardokers returned to their study. Jews, War, and Communism, a book by Zosa Sochkowski, documents the tempestuous years of communism, especially from an American historical perspective. That author had an unusual library containing periodicals and newspapers from all over the world at his disposal at the YIVO Institute, where he was a researcher for many years. He documents the involvements of Jewish-born communist personalities from the American political scene. One such communist turned repentant Jew, Maurice Malcolm, who was a union boss communist thug in the Furriers Union in New York City, wrote a book, Return to My Father's House. There were other penitents, such as Benjamin Gitlow, 1891 to 1965, who wrote a complete expose entitled The Whole of Their Lives, concerning the innermost workings of the Communist Party in the United States, which he headed for many years. It details how the Yiddish communist newspaper, Freiheit, was in reality a terrorist organization under the command of Stalin through the infamous OGPU security police, predecessor of the KGB, and how the newspaper staff of Freiheit carried out executions of targeted enemies of the party in the city of New York. He also details how an apostate rabbi, Alexander Biddleman, whom the communists nicknamed the Rabbi, masterminded the axing to death of Trotsky with a miner's pick in the brain on August 20th, 1940 in Mexico. While Stalin murdered Jews who had nothing to do with communism, he also murdered Jews loyal to him. Maurice Malcolm's brother, for one, returned to Russia and was murdered. Gitlow describes how two Jews helped Stalin to bring Hitler to power in Germany because it was in the communist interest to topple the German government. After performing their duties, they were summarily executed. Early on, Lenin laid the foundation for what is today the liberation theology among the Catholics and Islamic fundamentalism among the Arabs, a derivative of the Bolsheviks' party Islamic Marxism. The success of this lay in infiltrating these religions with agents, often even clergy, who professed to be anti-communist but indeed were pro. Accordingly, the KGB had operated a yeshiva to train their own brand of so-called rabbis in Romania. One of their graduates was installed by them as a chief rabbi of Kiev and informed the KGB about Jewish descent there, even leading to the arrest of underground rabbis who were involved in circumcising Jews clandestinely in the 60s and 70s, while it was against the law. The roots of Islamic Marxism were laid down by the Bolshevik Party during the years 1910 to 1919, as has been documented by A. Tahiri in his Holy Terror Inside the World of Islamic Terrorism. Islamic Marxism as an ideology is supported by the communist parties of Afghanistan, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. One byproduct of this activity was the establishment of the communist Hezbollah by the Ayatollah Khomeini, who built his power base with the Islamic communists of Iran, Syria, and Libya. Their guerrillas were trained by communist government professionals, including North Koreans. Abbas Samani, a major Hezbollah organizer in Lebanon and Pakistan, is a prominent KGB agent. In 1929, Jewish inhabitants of the city of Hebron, prior to the establishment of the Jewish state, were murdered by Arabs. This exposes the lie that the establishment of the state is a root cause for killing Jews there. 67 Jews were killed, 60 were maimed and wounded. The aged, women, children, and infants were not spared, in violation of Islamic law and the teachings of Muhammad on conquest and war in the Quran. The reason is that this was not a jihad, a holy war, but a communist barbaric slaughter. The victims were religious Jews. Synagogues were destroyed, Torah scrolls were burnt, and rabbis and students were murdered in cold blood as they sat and studied holy texts. To this very day, Jews are under the impression that this was a mere Arab Islamic outburst. In reality, it was a very well-executed exercise of the Communist Party. After the attack, thousands of Jewish-born communists throughout the world resigned from the communist parties of their countries. Although not acknowledged publicly, the remaining Geno-communists, that's Jews in name only, that were active in the labor parties of pre-Jewish state Israel were very happy about the pogrom because of their hatred for religious Jews and Judaism. However, these communists, merely because they lived in the Promised Land, were even too much for the Bolsheviks. So Stalin, the real butcher of Hebron, waged war to purge them from the party, resulting in further resignations of prominent communists such as Edward L. Israel, who in a letter on May 20th, 1936, stated, "The vicious attacks of the communists of Zionism, both in Russia and in Palestine, and now in America, represent an attempt to strike a death blow at the Jewish people. I cannot make common cause with those who are engaged in such a vicious undertaking." Lenin's liberation theology had its roots in Gnostic communist theology, and we'll get to that in the next chapter, but more directly relates to Thomas Munster of the German Peasant Revolt of 1525, who had been described as the Theologian of Revolution in a Bolshevik propaganda piece published in 1921 by Ernest Bloch. In 1972, 400 Christians for Socialism met in then Marxist Chile and declared that the time has come for a strategic alliance of revolutionary Christians and Marxists in the process of liberating the continent. Their leader was Catholic Bishop Don Sergio Mendez Arcillo of Mexico, who was assisted by Jesuit priest Gonzalo Arroyo, organizer of the Congress. Getting back to Jewish communist disenchantment with liberation theology vis-a-vis Hebron, Benjamin Gitlow describes scenes 10 years later, on August 20th, 1939, of Geno confusion over the Hitler-Stalin pact as follows. Then the bombshell exploded. The Soviet Union concluded a political pact with Nazi Germany, announced by Tass in the following tense words. After conclusion of the Soviet-German trade agreement, there arose the problem of improving the political relations between Germany and the USSR. An exchange of views on the subject which took place between the governments of Germany and the USSR established that both parties desired to relieve the tension of their political relations, to eliminate the war menace, and to conclude a non-aggression pact. The first one to read the news over the ticker was Paul Novick, editor of the Jewish daily Freiheit, the Jewish communist newspaper. He crumpled up the ticker sheet in anger and said it was a dastardly bourgeoisie trick. Beads of perspiration gathered around his forehead. He was speechless for some time. After all, he reasoned, the United Press would not go berserk on such an important piece of news. He went to his desk and looked at the Bulldog edition of the New York Times. He read Ferdinand Kuhn Jr.'s correspondence from London with an August 21st dateline. It stated, "The deadliest high explosive could not have caused more damage in London than the news late tonight that the Nazi and Soviet governments have agreed on a non-aggression pact behind the backs of the British and French military missions in Moscow." He rushed to the editorial offices of the Daily Worker in the same building. There was panic. Sam Don, whose real name is Donchin, the actual editor and boss of the Daily Worker, was present. Novick pressed on for a line of policy. In consternation, he asked, how should the news be treated? Others, standing around, said, we will be mobbed by the workers. Many communists who had read the early editions of the metropolitan papers besieged the office of the Daily Worker with telephone calls. Donchen, pale as a ghost, did not know what to say. Browder had gone out of town for a vacation, and the other leaders of the party, Foster, Miner, Satchel, including the representatives from Moscow, were unavailable. When Alexander Biddleman, the theoretician of the party, its Russian expert and the man who reads all the Russian papers in order to know what Moscow thinks on every subject, well, he was confronted by the frantic editors, and he did not know what to say either. He gave an order that a meeting of all party editors of all party papers and magazines should be held on the 9th floor that very afternoon, at which time he would outline the party's policy to them. The room was jammed with the members of the editorial staffs and party's press, but Biddleman had nothing new to say. He reiterated the party's stand in favor of collective security, in favor of a campaign against Hitler, and in support of the New Deal. For the first time in his life, this theoretician, who was always so positive in explaining Soviet policy, hemmed and hawed, stuttered and coughed, and finally had to admit that the leaders of the party had received no official word from Moscow. He was informed by the agitated editors that an answer must be forthcoming soon, because party members, besieging the editorial offices, were frantically demanding that they must know what to say. An interesting scene occurred in the offices of the Freiheit, the Jewish communist daily. One of the best-known party leaders among the Jewish workers in the garment section of New York is Sam Lipson. The party used him to get false passports from the U.S. State Department, on which Comintern representatives like Gerhard Eisler and OGPU agents traveled. For years, he had led the communist faction in Sidney Hillman's Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. His life was completely bound up with the workers in the garment center of New York. There he could be found gesticulating and arguing almost every day of the year. If any man was in a position to know the effect the pact had upon the Jewish workers, Lipson was the man. On the morning of the 23rd, he came rushing into the Freiheit office, hair disheveled, breathing heavily and much agitated. Turning to Novick, who in those memorable days tried to avoid everyone who came to the office, he exclaimed, "The workers are making a revolution against us. They are driving us out of the market. What has Stalin done to us? Why did he sign the pact? Everything we have built up for the last 20 years has been destroyed. I tell you, we are going to be stoned." Novick turned around on his heel, red with anger. "How dare you speak that way? Get out of here right away." He threw the frantic Lipson out of the Freiheit as a bum is thrown out of a saloon. But among the rank and file, the pact proved devastating. The party membership at the time was about 100,000. The Daily Worker unit, which had a membership of 35, made up of intellectuals, reported that 6 of its members resigned. The same proportion was resigning from the other units. The party suffered on a nationwide scale a 15% loss in membership. Over 15,000 members left the party. The poor American communist leaders who were left to their own resources without official instructions from the Comintern or from the OGPU or the Russian embassy floundered in the dark for 2 days and did not know what to do. The 9th floor of 13th Street was in bedlam. The editorial offices of the Communist Daily Worker and all other communist papers were swamped with inquiries. For 48 long hours, the communist leaders argued and debated about the line. Something had to be done, and done quickly, or else panic would break out in the party, and the party would suffer serious, irreparable damage. All the Jewish leaders of the party were called together for a secret special meeting. Foster, the chairman of the Communist Party, presented the new line. Instead of defending himself, he launched into a sharp attack upon the Jews, declaring that they were narrow and chauvinistic in their viewpoint on the pact. The Jews in the party, he charged, because of Hitler's anti-Semitism, had allowed them to determine their attitude and had lost sight of the bigger and by far more important political considerations involved. He demanded that the Jews take a stand as communists on the question and not as Jews. The tension in the meeting held the Jewish leaders glued to their seats. Many showed the strain of great mental and spiritual agitation, hands clutched to the chairs in front of them tightly. The top leaders of the party had come to club the Jewish leaders into submission, not to argue the question with them. The communist Jewish leaders were torn between two loyalties: loyalty to their people, who were the innocent victims of Nazi anti-Semitic bestiality, and loyalty to the cause of communism, upon which they had placed their hopes for the liberation of all mankind, including the Jews. Foster gave them no time to think. He pounded away at them with blows that stung. They knew that to oppose Foster meant to be made a target for vicious attacks, and to be driven out in disgrace from the movement that they had given their lives to serve. When Foster finished, a resolution endorsing the Soviet-Nazi pact in unequivocal terms was presented for adoption. Foster insisted upon an immediate vote. The Communist Party does not allow the members the privilege of taking the time of making up their minds. The Communist Party leaders, who were Jews, had listened to Foster, and now they must vote for the resolution. Abstaining from voting for the resolution or voting against it was tantamount to expulsion from the party. The few who asked questions or expressed their doubts during the discussion became the target for attacks by the party leaders, who were unrestrained in their abusive viciousness against them. They were given to understand that the Jews, more than any other element in the party, were expected to give the new line their wholehearted and enthusiastic support. Foster summed up with the full weight of Stalin, the Soviet Union, the Comintern, and the party in back of his words, and bludgeoned the Jews into complete submission to the resolution. According to undercover FBI agent Herbert Philbrick, Lawrence Shubo was a member of the Communist Party during the period when the Stalin-Hitler Pact was in force. However, he was a secret member of high rank. In a front-page story that appeared in the Boston Herald-American on April 27, 1978, it was reported that the author exposed Shubo at a State House hearing as a communist to prevent his appointment as a judge by Massachusetts Governor Dukakis. Unfortunately, the appointment prevailed. Herbert Philbrick, whom the author quoted, however, was contacted by the paper to corroborate testimony. The article stated, Philbrick, in a telephone interview with the Herald-American, said, Shubo was a member of the Communist Party about 1940 to 1949, and I ran into him around 1947 or 1948 in the underground in the Boston area. We were both in what was called pro groups, which were illegal and operated underground. Pro stood for Professional Revolutionaries, and there were about 70 to 80 of them in the Boston area. There were two levels of the Communist Party, above ground, which was legal, and underground, which was illegal. Membership in the pro groups was secret, even from rank-and-file party members. Shubo told the council he fraternized with people mentioned in Philbrick's book, but said, my views on the world changed in Harvard Law School before he became a lawyer in 1951. Boston Herald-American, April 27, 1978, front page. However, the following day, the paper changed its tune and supported Shubo. Lost in the shuffle and never reported was a document submitted by the author a few months old, naming Shubo in a petition with a contribution to support Patricia Bonner Lyon for school committee in Boston as the candidate of the Communist Party. So what is a little bit of perjury compared to wholesale murder for the party? The fact of the matter was that Shubo, who was also a vice president in the New England American Jewish Congress, supported an American Communist Party that had graduated from browbeating its Jewish-born members Foster style into full support of Soviet anti-Semitism. This was documented at hearings before the Committee on Internal Security in 1973 in the House of Representatives, entitled The Communist Party USA, Defender of Soviet Anti-Semitism. This was the situation 20 years after the death of Stalin, murderer of 30 million people, of which about 1 million were Jews. Stalin was planning to exterminate all the Soviet Jewry in 1953. He had trains and the military machinery all set up for the task. Amazingly, on Purim 1953, he died before he could begin the killings. On January 13, 1953, an article appeared in Pravda entitled Foul Spies and Murderers in the Guise of Professors of Medicine. This, the most important newspaper in the USSR, always fully expressed the views of Stalin, and all other newspapers repeated them. The accused were some of the most famous doctors in the country. The article said that the killer doctors, who were recruited into American intelligence through the International Jewish Organization, or JOINT, which purports to be a philanthropic organization, were killing their patients. All but 2 of the doctors were Jews. All of the accused, of course, confessed to their guilt in interrogation. Stalin's anti-Semitic campaign, began several years earlier, entered a new furious stage. In addition to his animosity towards Jews stemming from his anti-Semitism, Stalin saw that despite all his efforts to prove by theory that the Jews are not people, and despite the actions taken towards their assimilation by robbing them of their culture, the national self-consciousness of the Jews of Russia was only growing. Stalin saw that to the Jews he was not a god. He saw the enthusiasm with which they met around the few remaining synagogues, especially after the formation of the State of Israel. He saw that many even wanted to go to fight in Israel's war of independence. He was not able to break the Jews' spirit. Having suffered this defeat, Stalin decided to simply eliminate them. After Stalin's death, there was no systematic extermination of Jews. However, there was systematic persecution, which persists until today. The world's perception that communism is dead is misleading. It is in a new phase. There is today an appearance of freedom of worship for Jews in Russia. However, this was forced on Russia under Gorbachev, pursuant to world opinion against Jewish persecution, resulting in large numbers of Jews emigrating from Russia, mostly to Israel. However, today it is very difficult to emigrate, and the gulags are still functioning with their annual toll of tortured and dead prisoners. Indeed, according to the recently deceased distinguished author of Prisonland, Avraham Shifrin, the Soviets had succeeded in bringing about world indifference to the problem. As of this writing, Russia is arming Iran with missiles capable of delivering atomic weapons to Israel. Rabbi Yisrael Kagan, 1838 to 1933, known as the Shafetz Chaim, looking in retrospect over the Jewish Soviet communist experience, told Rabbi Elkanan Wasserman, "The Jews erred at the time. When the Jewish communists began their persecution, they should have confronted them with war and self-sacrifice. Even though many Jews would have died, they might have weakened the power of the Satan. Because none of us volunteered to fight and die if necessary, the Jewish communists have strengthened themselves in destroying the religious and cultural life of the Jews." Rabbi Kagan blamed himself and the Jews for passivity and for bringing upon themselves the plague of communist pillage and destruction. It is interesting to note that Rabbi Kagan believed in the use of force for Jewish survival, although he never made use of it himself. He once quipped, "The USSR is like a bathroom, where one is not allowed to utter the name of God, asking, 'How long can one live in the bathroom?'"